So thank you all so much for coming. We are very grateful to have you here watching and very honored that the current and future members of Team Canada, our national debate team, is here to present an incredible show round along with the gold champions of the EDC Junior Debate Tournament of 2022. So the background information for our motion today is immediate democracy is a system in which the voter may change their vote at any given time, thus changing the composition of the parliament on a daily basis according to public support. Our motion for today is this House would enact an immediate democracy. But first, I'll have the speakers introduce themselves. Cameras on, please. First, our champions opening government.
I went under Alien Camp for this tournament, but my name is Alina Liu, she, they pronouns for speaking on OG.
Yeah, speaking second, Dennis or Luke, Lou, it's whatever, he, him pronouns.
Thank you very much. Opening opposition.
First is Rally.
I'm speaking second, I'm Maria.
Thank you very much. Closing government.
First on CG, Tanush, he, him pronouns.
Second, Angela, she, her, please.
Thank you very much. Now closing opposition.
First will be Stellar, she, her pronouns.
Second will be Michael, he, him pronouns.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. And by the way, as I have said, from our opening opposition, closing government and closing opposition are all current and future members of Team Canada, our national debate team. So now, after the introductions, I call this round to order, and I call upon the Prime Minister to open the case of the opening government with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
Okay, cool. I'm taking my POIs in chat because I have Zoom open. Okay, speech begins in 3, 2, 1. Our current democratic system isn't really representative of the way people's opinions change and ebb over time. On the R side, we see that's going to be a better democratic system. On the basis of that, there's 4 pieces of what I want to say. First, this debate operates only in the context of well-established democracies, mainly focused upon Canada. Second, the way this will work is that voters will always have the option of changing their vote and instead voting for a different party or candidate. So if enough voters change their vote, then seats can swap from one party or candidate to another. Third, we'll still have consistent elections on the R side, but complement those semi-regular elections with immediate democracy. Fourth, we have the fiat power to assume that this will be implemented in a feasible and reasonable way. And moreover, given that this is likely to be controversial, its implementation will probably incentivize politicians to manage the system well to gain public approval. On basis of that, 2 arguments I want to forward. First, on why principally this is the most morally correct form of the government. Secondly, on why governance will be better. First, on the principle, there's 2 reasons why democracy has an overriding duty to accurately reflect voters' preferences. First, know that the state weaponizes a violent monopoly of force over citizens, but the lottery of birth renders people's ability to consent into the state's force. So the laws that the state enforces onto people can only be legitimate if those laws are actually molded by the people who are subject to them. Therefore, democracy is a binding duty to be maximally representative, and thus the state owes a reparative duty to its citizens. Second, the fact that there is no such thing as objective morality and that the policies we vote for are often quite subjective means that the state should always defer to the people when making policy. Given that there's no correct form of policies, it means that the state, which derives its legitimacy from the people it governs, must listen to the moral preferences to electorate of the people. So the state policy is subjective, and the state cannot dictate these sort of questions without consulting the people. And maybe opposition will make arguments on why this is practically bad, but we see that as irrelevant in face of this principle, because democracy is agnostic to outcomes, and the only moral consideration is probably the most important. And the conclusion of this principle then is threefold. First, we say that democracy is a non-utilitarian institution because its overriding duties to be representative. Second, know that given morality is the most important issue in this realm, we get a moral form of democracy maximizing the democracy's representational capacity by reducing policy lag. But third, even if by the end of the day, if we think that any of the practical hashes are even somewhat close or somewhat marginal, we should probably take the debate on OG, given the fact that the principle is going to be a deadlock breaker. Why is it that this is the only way for democracy to actually be fulfilled in the most preferable way? First, know that people's moral preferences change over time, but the fact that elections are held inconsistently and at random intervals every single 4 years means that the state is never fully representative of the popular will. Second, non-immediate democracy structurally suffers some lagging representation because policies are implemented before elections are held, which means that even if people disagree with those policies and may fear being harmed by those policies, they do not have direct ability to seek recourse. Immediate democracy fixes this because people can change their vote at any given moment in time. Third, maybe more practically, politicians on the our side know they can be voted out of office at any moment, which forces them to be representative to the will of the constituents. And whereas on their side, politicians know that the voters have short political memories and will primarily base their votes on the quality of life in the given few weeks leading up to an election. So thus, on our side, we incentivize politicians to be better able to discharge their more responsibility to its constituents. So then we say this principle is probably going to be an independent path to victory in and of itself. Second claim on better governance. The framing here is that the vast majority of opposition arguments are going to rely on the premise that a system of immediate democracy or the composition of the parliament is going to change very frequently and very drastically. But there's a couple of reasons why that is unlikely to be the case. First, the vast majority of voters do not change their party affiliation. And even if they disapprove of a candidate at one specific time or moment, they will also dislike the alternative parties enough to not change their vote. Second, most people do have a degree of status quo inertia. It takes time and effort to change one's votes, and the simple fact is that most people aren't going to change this that frequently. But third, even if a lot of people change their votes on a semi-consistent basis, this likely cancels out. And the reason for this is because a lot of people view policies in inverse ways. So some people might love a bill while others hate it. So this means that when the parliament passes a controversial bill, some people change their vote against the current party while others change it for the current party. But this means that it's unlikely to be very drastic. To be very clear, our claim here is not that nothing changes on our side. It's just that the scale of change isn't likely to be as crazy or radical as opposition might choose to push. So then why is this actively good? A couple reasons. First, even if the actual composition of the parliament doesn't change on our side, politicians still fear that at any moment of the day they could be voted out of office. And that gives them an incentive to do more outreach to its people to figure out what their voters want. That is the policies they support and an incentive to actually follow through on their demands. That doesn't happen on their side when politicians recognize they won't be voted out for many weeks, months, or years. Two, on our side, even when political outcomes change, it is more likely that the vote change will be moderate. And that is because people who are likely to change their votes are centrist voters, like center-left or center-right, since those on the extremes are very unlikely to change. This means that on our side, we create a moderating effect within politics. Third, immediate democracy strongly disincentivizes governments while being overly beholden to lobbyists. And that is because politicians know they can get away by passing controversial policies, even when those policies are widely unpopular, because people forget these policies unless they're hugely big. And now there's a disincentive from doing so. But fourthly, we get a faster response to things like crises, recessions, or pandemics on our side, because governments now know that they have to do good and eliminate a crisis at hand, or otherwise they're going to be out of power. So we see overall on the principle and also on the practical, we can probably take this one on OG.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the leader of the opposition to open the case of the opening opposition with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Good stuff. 4-year elections might be flawed, but immediate democracy is immediately bad, and that is why we stand to oppose. I'm going to give 3 points of response to their arguments, then I'm going to give 2 arguments. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why there are worse incentives for politicians to make bad policies. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this decreases compromise and creates a more polarized legislature. First, on response. The first argument is a principle. They say there's an independent normative obligation to represent people, irrespective of any practical outcomes. That is not true. The optimal way to represent would be to take a government referendum on every single policy. But we don't because we think that would be practically bad. It would create gridlock, much as this policy would. It's worth noting, we think it is morally legitimate to make decisions to delegate our moral agency to other people. Just as we can delegate decisions to our lawyer, we can delegate our decisions to our politicians who we think respond to us in good ways. Their second argument on quickening the political response. I'll just point out that if these issues are so important, they will be brought up in the next election. Trump mishandling COVID was brought up in the election because lots of people care about it. And I'm sure Biden messing up in Afghanistan will surely come up in the next election as well. So there are still incentives to respond quickly and well as to not jeopardize your long-term political future. If this argument is really about the small short-term issues, we think it is a fine trade-off to make under our side. Lastly, on the claim on lobbying, I think there are political accountability mechanisms that make sure that lobbying is much less significant. But maybe under their side, there will be more lobbying to the point at which the media doesn't cover all politicians at a specific set point in time, like an election, but rather there's much less coverage on a regular basis because it happens 365 days a year. First argument on worse incentives to politicians. I have only 3 this time. Number 1, on short-termism. We think there's a need for long-term policy in politics. Infrastructure plans allow for broad social benefits or worker respecialization programs. Like, fun fact, 8% of bridges in America are structurally unsound. That seems very dangerous. There's less of an incentive to actually engage in that long-term policy when there is no guarantee under their side that you will be around to see those benefits. So you will make short-term policies that give you broad political points right now that will guarantee that you are able in the next week or in the next month to retain onto your political power, but not any kind of that long-term policy that we think is important. The second thing to say is that politics under their side leans more towards extremism. And that is because of this. Most people will not change their vote at any given time, barring a large crisis, and they identify why, because this is annoying and difficult to do. So the only people who end up influencing these elections are those who change their vote and those who care a lot about select issues and have the loudest voices. We think this is bad because it means that single issue voters who care a lot about taxation policy or anti-gay marriage or abortion stances have lots more power because they can temporarily shift stances and change political makeups onto their side of the house. The comparative under our side is that everyone reevaluates their political stances during elections. So there's less power towards these people because they're a small portion of a large electorate, rather than the rapidly shifting constituencies that mean that in 1 week or in the other week, you might have more political power or less. Under their side, there's less political accountability as well, because everyone is not focused on this issue and nobody really cares anymore about elections to the point at which the primary political motivation and mobilization happens 365 days a year and not actually within election periods. The third thing I'm going to argue in this argument is that there's an increase in smear politics under their side. Yes, you have incentives to smear your opponents already, but only near elections. Their motion creates an incentive to do this always, because the way in which you temporarily displace your rivals and get control is to take advantage of momentary shifts in support, whether it's creating controversy over Obama's birth certificate or drumming up fear about a caravan on the border. The impact is that this distracts from actual pressing issues, but it also creates distrust within politics at net, because there's nobody who people feel they can trust, because an increase in smear politics will likely exist. That means more apathy, more support for fringe politicians who want to topple the establishment, and we think that is bad. Second argument about decreasing compromise and making sure that politics is more polarized. The first thing to say is that in the status quo, politicians do have incentive to compromise in some level on a variety of political issues, because there is certainty on the terms of engagement in the political sphere. You know that the other party has a certain amount of seats, that you need some of their support to pass one of your political objectives, and that's how you get plans like the Biden infrastructure deal, which in exchange for cutting back on government spending in some parts, was able to guarantee large amounts of infrastructure spending that Biden cares about. The problem with immediate democracy then is that it creates uncertainty about the political climate, which decreases that incentive to compromise in horse trading. First, because there's no guarantee the political climate of today will be the same as a month in the future. So there's no reason to make that compromise, because you can just wait out until the next political crisis or shift in faith happens and the other party loses support. You don't know if they'll be able to make good on their promise, or if they will even need to make good on their promise, because you will have more votes at that time. The second thing to say is that there are more perverse incentives to reverse policy that the other party passes. And you can get away with this because many policies are only popular after they are put into practice for a while. Comparatively, you can only do this 4 years after, in which case many policies may have become popular. We think compromise is important because it makes policies that are long-standing and robust, that it means that thousands of families can get stimulus checks for 4 more years, they can push through the pandemic, where under their side there's immediate harms that lead to short-term and temporary policy that we think ends up being bad for democracy. Proud to stand on opening up.
I thank that speaker for that speech. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case of the opening government with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
I'm audible.
Yes.
Perfect. POI thirdly. Okay. I want to make 2 things incredibly clear at the top of this speech. The first is that the polarization Rally tries to give you doesn't actually exist, insofar as a single voter or single issue voter characterization doesn't stand. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is just that very intuitively, you're probably not voting on a single issue insofar as there are multiple issues going on in the status quo. But the second thing is, if you are voting on a single issue, this issue is probably pressing. It's not a really random issue that's being brought up. This means that he concedes benefits, like calls for immediate action, which he tries to refute us. So their refutation already doesn't stand. The second thing I want to note is that the immediate attention we get on our side of the house means that we get better outcomes for immediately calling policies, right? So this is a reaction to COVID that would be far more immediate on our side of the house. On that basis and on the principle of proud to stand on OG. Few things then. First, rebuilding Alina's case, Alina's case. Second, discussing Riley's case. And then third, a last bit on the principal way. Okay, first on our case. They respond to the principal, I'll deal with this later. Their second response is just on like fast response times to crises. Riley said that this will come up in next election. The key word here is crises. Like presumably Trump being outvoted in the next election because of this issue and because of his handling of COVID caused to millions of deaths, caused to an economic travesty for the country. So if we had a faster reaction, presumably this would be better on our side of the house. USA got destroyed by COVID due to the slower reactions. It took a year and a half or like a year for Trump to get voted out of office. During this, around a year. During this time, millions of people were dying. The economy was suffering, and Trump's poor handling of COVID was still the status quo. What do we get on our side of the house on the comparative? On our side, this looks like an immediate call to attention. Because when something this drastic and something as fear-mongering as COVID comes up, it means we ask for immediate reactions. Because people who presumably are single issue voters for more extreme or more pressing issues like crises are probably going to vote on this, probably going to ask and call for action based on these issues, which means we don't get Trump and we don't get USA and their handling of COVID. The second thing I want to talk about is that they didn't actually engage with any or a lot of Alina's material. We tell you a few things. The first is that we get better government in general, as well as principle. Once again, I'll talk about that later. On the idea of better government, the first thing we say is that presumably there's not going to be that big of a shift in like ideology, and it's going to be mostly middle people voting, right? So the radical ideas on either side of the house are largely symmetrical. This engages with Riley's characterization of how people vote, insofar as you're probably not going to change your vote based on one crazy news article that you read. But if you see 5 of these news articles about like something that's wrong, then you're probably going to change your vote. What this means is that the radicalization they stand for doesn't actually exist on our side of the house. But furthermore, is that if there are 5 news articles on something that's legitimately pressing, we say that it's better that we can get the short-term inaction rather than their long-term 4-year democratic elections. By then, the crisis or issue will probably have boiled down to something way more tragic for society. Let's talk about their points then. The first thing to tell you is that there's like a short-term view on society now and view on politics. 2 things. The first is that presumably this is going to be more controversial. So short-term policies are going to be little minute changes. What this means is that there's a greater attention to politics and a greater attention to these short-term things. This directly negates their accountability mechanism, where they tell you there's less accountability because there's so many small little changes. We say, presumably it is true that there's going to be a larger focus on these small things, and some of these things are going to be blown up more than others. But also, they concede the short-term the crisis benefits. Lastly, on short-term changes, these might also be good it might be good to be in office in the short term. But once the bad impacts of like the long term comes out, the party is still going to get voted out. So this is symmetrical on either side of the house. If you implement bad policies, at the end of the day, after 4 years, you're probably still going to get voted out in the long term. The key weighing difference is A, the principle, and second, the short-term benefits we get. Let's talk about this principle really quickly. The conclusion of the principle is this. Democracy is a non-utilitarian institution because it has overriding duties to be representative. Therefore, in weighing this round, maximizing the moral legitimacy of democracy should be the topmost priority. Even if odd proves the system makes like people worse off, or it's more logistically a pain, or like worse economic outcomes, it does not matter as much, since the legitimacy of democracy is always more important than the utility of democracy. That's why we recognize, for instance, that even though democracies would be better off if they force the smartest people in society to work 24/7 on behalf of the state, or force people to take tests before voting in order to have better representation and actual technocratic decisions, that would still be disgustingly wrong because of the nature of a democracy. Given this morality, it's the most important issue in the debate, because we get a more moral form of democracy by maxing out democracy's representation capacity, by reducing policy lag, all these things that they tell you. So at the end of the day, even if by the end of the day, you think that there is any practical clashes that are somewhat close or somewhat marginal, you give this round to OG, since our principle is a deadlock breaker within this round. On that basis, proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for that speech. I call upon the deputy leader of the opposition to conclude the case of the opening opposition with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
Everyone can hear me? Okay, wonderful. 1 second. Three things to talk about in this speech: why the principle doesn't matter in this debate, how policies are likely to be impacted, and how the political system at large is impacted. Principle first. OG Case explains that voting is an imperfect means of absolute consent because elections only happen every few years, and that does not control for time within a political term. Fine. The problem with this analysis is that there is precedent for the state not requiring our universal consent in order to quote unquote violate our autonomy within the political process. For instance, like Raleigh explained, we don't vote on every single issue in a representative democracy. We don't attend referenda to decide every train stop that gets built or every inflationary economic policy that gets passed. Even though referenda might be more principally legitimate in concordance with state power, we're definitely willing to override that so long as we understand that there will be practical impacts, huge bureaucracy, delay of policy, low voter turnout that leads to inaccurate representation. And we're totally okay with overriding people's autonomy in order to solve a collective action problem or to turn to expertise if we know a vote would take too long. When a vote takes too long, we know we will just implement relief bills, austerity measures, in economic crises or during natural disasters. Perhaps waiting for a vote when a devastating tsunami hits would be more principally accurate, but in that time, thousands of people will lose their lives and their livelihoods, will die huddled in storm shelters with no clear action, with no money to tide them over when banks have broken down overnight. OG wants to talk about crises. Those are the crises that we envision. If the state has to violate rights to maximize utility, we say that is justified. When there are severe practical implications, democratic principles matter not. That's over with. Policies and how they're likely to be impacted. OG makes a poor strategic decision when they immediately present a defensive practical argument in PM that people's votes are likely to cancel out. If that was true, then politicians have no incentive to be held any more accountable if they were otherwise, if that's the way the system exists, where people's votes are just going to cancel out and nothing is going to get done. But to be charitable, let's pretend politicians are held accountable. We say they're going to be held accountable in poor ways. I'll explain that later. OG's example debating, however, in DPM is flawed as well. They give us one circumstance where Trump's bad COVID policy hurt many, millions of people because of his lack of action. Yes, and the backlash he faced that he lost the election, that it hurt his chances ever, was devastating to him. Logical administrations wouldn't do that. They're held accountable for the kinds of things their constituencies do. This is, in fact, a great example for us because it proves that if you do not do the kinds of things where there's huge amounts of political will to do so, you're going to lose the election. That is not something any politician is likely to do. But let's discuss short-termist politics. The premise of what Raleigh explained to you is very simple. There's no way that legislation will be long-lasting because politics is reactionary. It's tied inherently to people's emotions, the issues that people care heavily about, the ones that impact them day by day. There's the ones that reach deep into their soul. An international summit between leaders gone wrong, for instance. People act immediately on their decisions. They're spurred by social media. They're spurred by all the people around them and themselves that reinforce that kind of emotion. DPM says, this is good because these singular issues are important to people. I agree that they are important, but that doesn't always mean that their decision is correct. Because singular actions, singular policies, the irrationality of our fear should never be determined of the kind of country that we want to live in. Because that means that politicians cannot implement long-term policy like general changes to education, to reforming of healthcare, to building of alliances with countries. It means that they actively seek out short-termist policy, the mechanism exactly being what OG told us about politicians and accountability. They want to remain in power when short-term policy actually gets done. Constituents can see that short-term policy. If long-term policy never gets passed, they are seen as doing nothing and they get voted out. OG doesn't contest that that is likely going to be the circumstance, but why is this round-winning material? The kind of legislation that requires large amounts of time and effort, the Green New Deals, the building up of a free trade agreement that will economically rejuvenate you and your neighboring countries, that will give hundreds of thousands of people jobs, healthcare reforms, reforms of the elective system. They don't happen overnight. These are the kinds of things that you require lots of time to be put in. And broad sweeping legislation like that is the most important because it is the most tied to the basic necessities and needs of the vast majority of society, especially considering infrastructure takes such a long time to get changed, or that is integral to alliances with other countries and international relations that is the tipping point between conflict, especially with uneasy hegemons like China, for instance. OG, if you have a POI, go ahead. Okay, political system and how it is impacted. The last thing that we explained was that was why politicians that would act in office would act in poor ways. So number one, they would smear their fellow candidates. It would become identity politics that would be messy. It would lead to political horse trading, to politics where people would just run to the middle and never take strong opinions on everything. We see that the kind of political system that we explained in Rally's speech and the kind of system that is not really contested by DPM is the exact kind of system that isn't representative at all. If we cared about representation, as OG clearly seems to do in their principle, we care about a system where people are actually able to get policy that definitely reflects the kinds of needs that they want, that definitely reflects the kind of life that they want to live. That doesn't happen if we're changing every so often. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for that speech. Now I call upon the member of government to open the case of the closing government with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
At the top of my speech, I want to note something very clear. The massive harm or the massive impact in this debate is not going to come from this vote actually happening or there being massive legislative changes on a day-to-day basis. Because as OG and O have both pointed out, that is probably very unlikely. Rather, on CG, our case is going to be very simple. We're going to focus on two things. Number one, why this leads to more citizen engagement and media reporting on politics, why that's a necessarily good thing, regardless of there being any marginal practical changes. Number two, why this leads to more collaboration on political issues at large, and why you get more policy changes, both in the short term and in the long term, dealing with opening opposition's case. First extension then, on why this leads to citizenship engagement. The premise of this extension is relatively straightforward. There's two structural reasons why it's more likely that people are engaged in politics to a greater extent on our side. Reason number one, reporting on our side is more perpetual. So to the point at which people can vote at any point in time, every time there's a crisis that happens, for instance, or an issue that's being debated within Parliament, for example, there's more reporting on it on our side of the House. Why is this comparatively different than like the comparative on their side? First of all, on their side, reporting is often very concentrated when re-election is at stake and those sorts of things. Oftentimes, long-term issues don't sell much in the media, or issues at large that are broadly seeing a lot of legislative change aren't that attractive. And the structural reason for this is quite simple. There isn't much that citizens can do as a consequence, so reporting on these issues is often unfavorable. Second, citizens have more of a vested interest on our side of the House to do things like have more engagement within politics. Presumably, if they now know or feel that they can make structural changes from voting at any point in time, it is often more of a civic duty on our side of the House to do things like make sure you're informed on politics, on even the most mundane of things like tax laws that might be being debated in Parliament on Monday. Why do we think this argument is relatively crucial in the context of this debate? Number one, because on our side of the House, when voter engagement goes up, the choices that democracy make at large as a consequence of them voting also becomes more representative of people's wills at large. Right now, people that are often engaged in things like voting, or people that are often engaged in voting or in politics as a whole, might come from positions of privilege, or at the very least are individuals that have the capacity to engage in the first place. On our side, engagement becomes more trickle down in nature when there's more access to things like educational resources on political issues at large. Extension number two, before that, I'll take a POI.
People have other things going on in their lives, like attending debate tournaments, so they don't have time to read the news 24/7. Under our side, when everything's centralized near an election, you can read up then and you can focus on it then. But under your side, you have absolutely no idea what to do or when to read because everything is going on always.
But sure, maybe that's also true, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in my second argument. But the point at which reporting on your side only happens within a concentrated period of window, if your characterization of like people being short-termist voters is correct, then there's no scrutiny for the other 3 years of like legislative change that happens. Presumably that's harmful because people are voting on a short-term bill anyways. No. Extension number two, on why this leads to more collaboration in politics. At the top of this extension, I want to note that there's going to be massive public pressure to do things like have to pass more bills over time on our side of the House. Firstly, if OO is correct and the political climate is unclear, there's still a pressure to pass policy at large as a consequence. Number one, there's perpetual scrutiny on our side because of our first argument when people are more engaged in politics. But second, Politicians can no longer do things like objectively focus on campaigning for the year or so prior to elections that might happen on the counterfactual. What that then means is people vote based on legislative change on our side of the house, not based on things like campaigning, because civic duties are still being fulfilled by politicians perpetually on our side of the house. Secondly, there's often scrutiny within states, for example, from your opposition who might not be in office. That scrutiny is often constant, which also puts a pressure on politicians to act and enact change on our side of the house. Why is this crucial? First of all, this means on our side of the house, the way people vote is based on the actions that politicians actively make when they're held in office. So for instance, there's now massive pressure to do things like not filibuster over time, because that is viewed as a waste of time and a waste of your potential as a politician. Those things become less salient on our side of the house, less common in things like parliament on our side of the house, as a consequence of the fact that people want to collaborate. It's worth noting over here that this acts both in immediacy and in the long term, as OO might not want to characterize. Firstly, because things like infrastructure plans are something that if you enact as a form of structural change, presumably don't see much backlash because everybody agrees as them being generally good. OO's only response here was long-term bills aren't viewed as structural change. Like I wouldn't say if that's true or not. Presumably it's not true. Like infrastructure plans, like fixing the 8% of bridges that are bad is a good thing on our side of the house. So the conclusion of this argument is quite simple. You have more collaboration as a consequence of the fact that there's more scrutiny and more pressure for you to collaborate as a consequence. There's more, people care more about the actions that you make as opposed to any other thing. It is on that basis that we propose.
I think that speaker for that speech. I call upon the member of the opposition to open the case of the closing opposition with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
Okay, hi. It's been a long time since I've done BP. Let me mute that real quick. Side government ties every politician's hands behind their back. The cost of a democracy that is more responsive on their side of the house is also a democracy that is completely incapacitated. Politicians that are vulnerable to the whim of an extremely volatile, unpredictable electorate and having to make their every decision calculated based on whether or not it will get them booted out of office tomorrow. That is not a functional democracy in any sense, and we're incredibly proud to oppose. I'm going to start off with refutation to both government sides, then we'll be for an extension about a politician's incapacity to push unpopular policy. Firstly, on refutation, we're going to start with closing government. Their first extension focuses on the idea of citizen engagement, that more news will come out because they're under constant scrutiny, and that there's also going to be more interest in this news as well. Firstly, just because the news exists does not mean that people have the will, the attention span, or the emotional capacity to read it. News that is being bombarded at you all the time, the vast majority of it negative, school shootings, COVID information, the increasing inflation, is incredibly emotionally exhausting and draining for people to want to follow all the time, even if they are people that are actively politically invested. But the vast majority of people are not politically invested. They're people that only tune into elections whenever they're happening every 4 years and will follow it periodically. But they're the kinds of people that have jobs and families and lives to attend, that are incapable of following news every single day, of focusing on every politician's move and deciding whether or not to change their vote tomorrow in the morning. What this means then is that it's very easy for citizens to feel burnt out by the amount of news that is coming at them, and also even more uninterested in democracy. Already, we are struggling to have enough voter turnout when elections happen every 4 years. If elections are happening every single day, the amount of energy, time, and attention that you can devote to each individual one is reduced drastically. On the second half of this extension, though, their claim is that there's actually more interest in this because people feel as though they can make individual changes. The first thing to point out, as both their opening and themselves have pointed out, is that it's unlikely that they're going to change politicians every single day. What's much more likely is that you're going to have people only responding to things when it comes into controversy, which means that each individual vote does not really mean anything more. It rather means that people just feel as though they have the responsibility to do so without necessarily needing to take it on. But the second thing to point out is, as I've already stated, emotional energy, time, and attention are not something that everyone can spare to read like CNN for 24 hours a day. And that means that more people are going to be disengaged with democracy that is bombarding news at them all the time. Citizen engagement goes down on side government. Their second argument is on public engagement, how this means that politicians are under constant scrutiny all the time, and it motivates them to act better. But what this scrutiny does is it does not incentivize the right kinds of action. It incentivizes them in a very Machiavellian way to continue to push promises, the promises and the idea of action, because they're never being able to actually fulfill their policy, because they don't know if they're going to still be in office to pass a bill or push forward an important piece of legislation. They're incapable of doing that. They spend 24/7 on campaign mode, where they're making promises to their electorate rather than actually following through on them, because they're always at the whim of their electorate. Finally, they point out that infrastructure plans, stuff like that, are incredibly uncontroversial, but we would argue something that takes 10 to 15 years to actually come to fruition, when there's much more pressing issues on people's minds, those things easily can be controversial. Things like climate change, which require urgent action, but won't see necessarily the impact until years later, those things are actually controversial in the status quo as well. Finally, refutation to opening government. Their largest push here is that their principle wins them the round, that there's this normative idea that democracy ought to be absolute, and insofar as daily representation is maximum representation, then this wins it for them. There's two problems with this. Firstly, already in the status quo, democracy is not something that we fulfill absolute. We put constraints on democracy for the sake of practical outcomes. And it's not simply that because we don't limit people's vote, democracy is completely non-utilitarian. For example, like we don't allow people under 18 to vote. And that's a practical constraint that we put on democracy, even though technically people under 18 are being affected by democracy and theoretically would deserve a voice or representation. We don't allow people under 25 to run for politicians. That's a constraint on democracy that we place for the sake of utilitarian outcomes. So democracy is not an absolute in which you're always trying to pursue the maximum, representation. And that means that convenience and the actual implications of whether or not this is going to help a democracy ought to be taken into account in this debate as well. They cannot claim that there's a normative principle to maximize representation to no ends, and that means that they win. Really quickly on this extension then, because again, 5 minutes is really short. Wow. Firstly, on why they're unable to pass unpopular policy. It's not just about the short versus the long term. It is the fact that politicians often have to make decisions that are actively unpopular in the moment, but pay off later. So for every example of Trump they can bring up, we can also bring up examples of politicians that imposed necessary strict lockdowns and that ended up paying off in the very long term, but would have gotten them immediately booted out of office. These are necessary actions that politicians need to take. Bills and campaigns that take years to come to fruition, but are important, but politicians can't do if they're afraid of being kicked out of office the next morning. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. Now I call upon the government whip to conclude the case of the closing government with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
All right. Contrary to what Stellar claims, it is actually the opposition bench that is tying people's hands behind their back. They are in fact guilty of tying voters' hands behind their backs at the point at which you vote for someone and you are stuck with the choices that you made 4 years ago, no matter how sluggish and how idiotic the person you voted into office is. I'm going to summarize this debate in two themes. First, in terms of what happens to voters, and second, in terms of what happens to the quality of the policies that get passed. So first of all, let's talk about voters. Tanush explains to you a marvelous, juicy extension on how immediate democracy leads to greater citizen engagement, about how media has an increased incentive to educate people about politics, about how people feel like their vote can make an increased difference in democracy. Why is this round winning? A, this is the most important consideration in democracy, which is the fact that democracy is made up of the people. Because if you don't have accurately informed voters, your results are skewed, people are not accurately represented, and they don't vote in their own best interests. Rally and Stellar basically pirate off of each other's responses, which goes to show how much Op in general has to say in this debate. They say people are busy, you only want to care about elections in election season, and also people get bored and disengaged. Yeah, but the point is now everything is constantly an election, which is why it becomes interesting for people, which is why the media always has an incentive to report on things. No thanks, because you are always able to mobilize voters around the prospect of changing who they have voted for.
And in terms of always being bombarded by negative information, like the press has incentives to get people to read more, right? So they talk about the positives too. You talk about new things. One week it's infrastructure, the next week it's like a politician's personal life. That's a small concern coming from Stellar. And here's where we blatantly weigh out against OG. They center around the principle, which is cool, and we think it is a very valid argument, but let's be honest, very few people actually go in depth and read political theories all day. What matters, what has the greatest impact on the most people and their happiness is how they feel about the fact that their vote carries power. The second reason Tanish's extension is round winning is that it implicitly takes down the crux of opposition's case, which is essentially about how like short-termism is bad, essentially also the same thing that Stellar says in her like very, very short extension that was quite pirated and derivative as well. No offense, Stellar. So about like how you need to bear a period of, for instance, really bad taxation policies in order to get infrastructure projects. The problem is people are only unhappy with those things when they don't know about the long-term picture and why those things are going to be good for their country in the long run. On our side, politicians have an incentive to explain that better because there are these increased citizen engagement. Speaking of that point also, it's just very unclear why it is that these long-term policies matter so much. If something is so controversial that it's going to literally get outvoted on their side, probably they should have consulted the people in the first place. Now, before I move on, no Michael, but to show solidarity to the prop bench and the unjust POI claim that was given by Maria. Opening, do you have a POI? Okay, Michael, go ahead.
News coverage is inherently zero-sum and finite. This means that if you are covering Canadian politics, it's going to come at the expense of the invasion of Ukraine. Why do you think this is a preferable trade-off on proposition?
No, but you would just cover both of them. You would cover how Canadian politicians are dealing with Ukraine. You would cover the most topical issues that impact people and that impact the world. Let's talk then about the second theme on what happens to the quality of the policies that are passed. Tanush tells you about how there's going to be less gridlock because politicians are getting constantly judged on their performance, so they can't really procrastinate. Stellar says it's bad to be in campaign mode 24/7, but we think that's not the case because it's not the case that they're just going to be making empty promises now. At some point, you have to actually get stuff done because if 6 months into your term, you haven't passed a single policy you said you were going to do 6 months back, people are just going to vote you out. But crucially, Tanush also tells you about a host of other reasons why we get better policies. Things about how you have to cater to the middle now because the voters that are going to switch sides easily are the ones that are more centrist and more moderate, which boosts things like collaboration. That is also immensely important because it prevents bad things that hurt democracy, like toxic and unhappy polarization, all things that, by the way, neither of the opposition teams bothered to respond to in their speeches. So at the end of the day, we have weighed out against opening government. We have proven to you that CO doesn't have much of a case that is new, and also that OO's case was bad in the first place. On all those grounds, we're very proud to be on CG.
I thank that speaker for that speech. I call upon the opposition whip to conclude the case of closing opposition and the debate as a whole with a speech not exceeding 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hear, hear.
Before I start my speech, after that insult from Angela, I will not be taking a POI from CG and only taking POIs from OG. Or OO. OO, feel free. The closing opposition strategy worked. We disguised our extension as refutation, and as a consequence, the Gov Whip conveniently forgot to respond to it. So what was our extension? We focused specifically on the individual, how the individual level of voter on their side of the house is not going to vote. They're going to feel alienated from society. They're going to feel like this endless news coverage means that they can never feel in touch with political candidates, and as a consequence, they will not vote. On opening opposition, they focused exclusively on the broad political outcomes, i.e. on gridlock, i.e. on politicians' incentives to be short-termist. But as opening Gov and eventually closing Gov as well pointed out, those things eventually became a deadlock and washed out, which leaves the very, very obvious impact that Gov Whip was trying to chase after, but was unfortunately asserted in closing Gov, of trying to get individuals to be more motivated to vote in the political system. I'll make a number of responses then, first of all on the individual to the claims you got out of Gov Whip, and then I'll talk then about the second thing on accountability and how we're able to break the front half deadlock as well. So first on the individual. by Angela's speech, we get a couple of assertions to the tune of, look, guys, people are going to feel like the election is interesting. We will get continuous wall-to-wall coverage on elections, and people will love that. So first of all, I think there's a finite amount of minutes you can spend watching Wolf Blitzer talk about the polls in Iowa before you eventually want to pull all of your hair out and go to sleep. That point is probably like 1 or 2 days. I watched the election once in my life. I am never watching it again for more than 12 hours. But second, note here that we explained to you, especially in our extension, that there was a tipping point that mattered. That when you had an election, that was a huge concentration of coverage that meant you were able to get access to the juicy details. You were able to have investigative journalists chase down politicians' extensive histories and look into their private lives, because that was the demand for that type of investigation in the first place. On-site government, there was no demand to do that. You were just covering the basic day-to-day things. Like, you are literally the C-SPAN camera showing a half-empty Senate vote on some random bill trying to legalize the speed limit to be 3 kilometers faster. That is the difference in coverage that happens on government and on opposition. So what we get is a lot of good, high-quality coverage leading up to an election, featuring investigative journalists being able to dig into people's private lives, whereas on-site government, you just get the classic, standard, boring coverage that doesn't actually promote any type of accountability. The demand, the viewership, the ratings simply aren't there, and ultimately that means you're unlikely to get this type of journalistic integrity. The second claim that government wanted to forward, though, was under the idea of coverage, and there's a very glib response to the POI. They say, but we would just cover how Canadian politicians are responding to the crisis in Ukraine. Obviously, news coverage is very finite. There are numerous issues going on in the world, especially what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, covering what Vladimir Zelensky is saying to their everyday people, covering what the mayor of Kyiv might be saying. Whereas on-site government, what they would do is talk about how Justin Trudeau is responding to the crisis in Ukraine. These are drastically different things with drastically terrible outcomes when you now have a bunch of Canadians that are uneducated about society. The likely outcome here, by the way, is even worse than what Proposition could have imagined. It means that people, in order to get access to global news, turn away from Canadian news channels and instead decide to go for American or other news channels where there are no Canadian issues and people become even more uneducated than in the status quo. And that exactly was what we think is the active harm that the Gov case ultimately provides. So I'll take the POY OG.
Who's the best member on TC?
Okay, anyways, continuing on with the second thing I want to respond to. Their second half of the extension also shows how badly, or how they misunderstood the political system. Tanush says, look, guys, people won't want to stall in politics anymore, i.e. they won't filibuster. You realize this, right? The party in power never wants to filibuster. It's not like Justin Trudeau is actively going to filibuster his own party. The opposition party is the one that is filibustering in the first place. And probably under this system, opposition parties would still have an incentive to stall, because that is the literal premise of an opposition party, which means that in all circumstances, we will still have gridlock in government. This indicates to you that Tanush's second extension only seeks then to wash out the front half. And I'm talking about my second theme now. Let's talk about the deadlock that happened in front half. So opening op's claim here was that people are short-termist, that politicians will now become short-termist, and that single-issue voters are going to have drastically too much power. The response we heard out of government was, no, look, there are multiple types of single-issue, there is no such thing as a single-issue voter. There are multi-issue voters, something which was conveniently not responded to in DLO, which means that it is still standing. And secondly, this means that on GovWhip, we are still left with a deadlock, which means that we don't actually know what the relative degree of short-termist nature of politicians will be. Probably politicians will be short-termist on both sides. They will still have 4-year election periods, which is not that drastically different for a 6 to 1 year difference that would probably happen on-site government. The relative accountability will be the same. We'll still get similar amounts of things like impeachment processes, and otherwise, political leaders want to be good people and enact good policy. So I think in the broad circumstances, people will still have their own constituents in mind. But what we told you was that for individuals who are most vulnerable, those that couldn't afford to watch CNN for 12 hours a day, losing the will to vote and ultimately being shut out from the democratic system was the biggest harm. And for that reason, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and thank you so much to all of the current and future Team Canada members, as well as our gold champions of the EDC Junior Debate Tournament 2022 for a spectacular, very engaging debate round. And I thank all of you so much for watching. The show round is now over. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.